So good afternoon. My name is Shelly Barrick-Parsons, and I do serve as the Executive Director and Presbyterian Campus Pastor at West Virginia University. It is an interesting place that I'm in terms of background. We talking about our context and frame of reference. I went to a Southern Baptist Women's College. Since then, it's not necessarily Southern Baptist, still Women's College, but I went to one where religion was integral to the life of the campus, to now serving a public university. And I serve in a campus ministry position, so that puts me somewhat on the outside of the university. I'm one of those little houses that's plopped around surrounding the university, looking for a way in. And so I think I'm supposed to talk about civic engagement in higher education. I did read the book, and what I heard in the book was that part of the goal of higher education, institutions, classrooms, programs that take place on our college and university campuses is that higher education is to be a training ground for public life. And it is interesting to note, because my PhD did do education, not everybody agrees with that, and we heard that today, that sometimes higher education is simply to train us for professional careers. But higher education is a training ground for public life. It's to educate for values, ideals, and standards. And then I wanted to add in that it's also a place to hone our frame of reference. I did years ago preach a sermon where I took a giant frame and talked about that we come with a frame of reference, that we view the world, Calvin and the glasses, how we see the world. And part of college is figuring out that frame, shifting it, and learning. In terms of religion and higher education, from my experience, it is to provide, as Regal and others mentioned, and I'll talk more about, the grounding for participating in public life. What is the reason, the ethics, the traditions? What is that part of the framework that calls you out into public service? And again, I think it's for honing one's frame of reference. And I ask this as a question. Is it the job of religious organizations, institutions, to provide those opportunities for civic engagement? It's a question to ponder. Or is our pure responsibility to provide the tradition, the background, and the critical thinking? And then I'd ask a question about what is civic engagement. Is it simply community service and political activism, which was talked about in the book, or is there more to civic engagement? And I say yes, that it's probably more than activism, trying to create a better future, and it's more than community service in terms of meeting tangible needs in some of the traditional ways we think about it. And so I decided if I was going to talk about this, I'd come up with a theological definition of civic engagement. And that is to witness to a better future, and I'm going to use a Christian, Protestant, pretty old school term, kingdom of God, to witness to the kingdom of God outside the circles in which we feel the most comfortable. So one of the things is we like to be with the Presbyterian Campus Ministry, the people who agree with us theologically, politically, religiously, economically, gender, race, whatever it is, that part of political civic engagement is witnessing to the kingdom of God outside where we feel the most comfortable. And it is to meet tangible needs we see present in our community. And that I do believe the role of religion in higher education is to help provide that language, that grounding, and hope as part of the framework for engaging in opportunities, first to provide the framework and opportunities second. And I think it's also to provide a challenge of where and how an engagement happens. To the perhaps civic engagement increasingly, and this is from me as a Protestant, pretty moderate to liberal Christian, that maybe some of our civic engagement these days is apologetics or whatever the right word would be, to the community on behalf of faith communities. Some of my experiences, like Regal said earlier, what's the first thing you think of when you think of a Christian? And some people think ignorant, stuck in the mud, hypocritical, or judgmental. So is civic engagement also being a Christian in the world that shows religion in a different way? I'm going to argue at the end that civic engagement for college students in particular actually is to communities of faith. That it's not just into the political realm, the civic realm, but that college students and their view of the world and their way of interacting in that pluriform way have a responsibility back to communities of faith who maybe haven't made some of the leaps that are being made in academia, or to help with that conversation. And it is to needs, and it is to the political realm. So those are all places that civic engagement happens. But for me, when I was thinking about this, I just thought, why does it matter? Like, why do we engage in activities outside the community of faith that point to a different reality than the current one we see? And I wonder how many of us in this room could say with clarity why it is you advocate for a particular issue, why it is you serve a particular nonprofit, why it is you teach in a certain way from your belief tradition. How many of you could say that clearly? There's lots of us who are pastors and well-educated church people in here and of other beliefs. But I wonder how many people as adults, forget the 18 to 24-year-old adult, can really actually say that themselves about this is what, I joke sometimes and say, what would Jesus do? But do people even ask that sort of question? Or what does it mean to love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself? And is that what's driving you out into the world? That's a Christian perspective. But I do think that that is a big responsibility. Maybe that's the responsibility of the organizations that I serve, which are organizations outside the institution. But I think it's also, again, part of the dialogue that needs to happen in classrooms. To teach that why. It is that unexamined faith that's coming either from our failure in religious education, or from the fact that there's so many whys to choose from now. It is, I think, somewhat a failure. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I worry about what they'll be able to say. Will they participate in the historic religion? And I know I may fail them as a parent, because all I say is, I don't care what they do, as long as they do something and don't get rebaptized. And I'm sorry if that is part of your tradition, but we all have the thing, when there's a line somewhere, we draw in the sand. And because of Presbyterians' prevenient grace theology, I mean, it's not because I think that's right or wrong, but because of the theology of the prevenience of grace, and while we baptize as infants, that is how they could just stick it to me. So don't anybody tell them. So one of the things that we do, a real specific thing that sort of we are grateful as a public institute, as a public ministry on a public campus, we have also received Lilly Endowment funds for the theological exploration of vocation. And that has helped us, and we're just in our first year of implementing it, to begin to look at ways we can help people really explore who they want to be in the world. So one of the things we were doing informally was inviting in folks like professors to talk about what they do for a living and what that has to do with their beliefs. And we have formalized that this year into something called a Faith and Life Speaker Series. And right now we don't invite in religious leaders or people who have sort of ordained or sanctioned roles in religious communities. We invite in someone from the community who's doing work outside sort of the formal religious leadership. So our first speaker was the president of the university, President Gee. Our second speaker was Brandon Dennison from the Coalfields Development Corporation. And then we have Joan Stewart from the West Virginia Ministry of Advocacy and Work Camps. And Dan Kimball, the president of the Morgantown Chamber of Commerce. They are invited to come eat dinner with the Presbyterian campus ministry, and then invited for a larger public forum where they talk about how did they get where they are. And we don't want the flowery story of we want the story of I really struggled with this, or this is what I challenged, because part of what we want to do is have students hear how people of faith and belief are actually applying that to the work they do, and not in that sort of, we tell call stories when we were ordained, God spoke to me, but more in the struggles of I was going to do this, but then I heard this and I changed my mind, or I live my faith out in this way in my context. So that's one of the ways that I think it's really important to help students begin that civic engagement in the larger world. You might want to call it, you could go even more formally and call it mentoring if we really help to pair students with people who are out in the real world, because I think there is that disconnect about where this system, this framework, gets applied to the larger context. In addition to that, we're doing work. We just had a retreat this weekend where we looked at vocation not in what are you going to be when you grow up, and talked about what is it that you already have and not have in the gifts of the things that you see in the Bible, the spiritual gifts, but what is it you have? Time, resources, grace, and how are you going to live those out? Who is it you want to be and to live out that grace in the world? And what do you want to do, but not do in the what's your job going to be, but do in living out the mandate to love. So again, trying to shift the framework away from sort of specific actions or specific careers to how people live lives of faith and belief in the broader spectrum and in their everyday activities. Let's see, what else? We talked about the Faith and Life speakers. But one thing I will say, the other thing we do, and I would assume many other campus ministries do this, is we do provide community service and we do provide mission trips. And I would say where there's a failure, if I was to admit to any failure, there's lots of them. That's why my children aren't here, but they're not failures, but they can tell you what you've done wrong. We do great work going to Costa Rica or to Nicaragua or traveling somewhere, and then we're missing that action reflection component. And that really is probably a component that's missing in the college, on the college campus, on these international trips that are taken, not necessarily for mission or service purposes, but for growth and cultural understanding. Is we go, we have a great time, it's life-changing, and then what happens when we get back? Forget. We might give a presentation to thank people who helped support the trip, but where is that next conversation about what did you believe before this? How did you experience that there? And how has that underscored? How has that informed? How has that transformed your beliefs? And where is that leading you now? So I think that is a place that, at least in our ministry, we have not done as well, is that next step when you come back, when people are primed to have those conversations about solidifying their convictions and their values. So I would say that's something to look at, and that is something that can happen within the university context. What is the reflection afterwards about what did you learn about your own economic and political system and values if you spent time in a country whose economics and politics are different? It doesn't even have to be religious conversations, but those are value and conviction conversations. Some of the things that we do that are practical, I'll say, we talked about social media. We just went to the Green Bank Observatory. If you ever want to take students somewhere where you can have their undivided attention and have a good experience, there's no cell service there. It's great. But I think in this day and age in social media, one of the difficulties with civic engagement is too much information. What are you going to pick when it's scrolling through your newsfeed every day? There's the too much information, and then there's the sense that if I just share this Facebook post, and that'd be a great way, another great program to have. If I just share this Facebook post about a political candidate, about a cause, I'm doing something. And we can, there's certainly been studies to show people have been engaged and movements have arisen through Twitter and other places. But that's another problem. One, I think it creates a sense of we've done something. But two, I think it also creates a sense of helplessness. Again, so one of the things that I would like to see that we have not implemented is a sustained focus on a particular issue. We tend to serve and do this, and I would recommend and would hope to implement at some point that this year our focus is going to be hunger. And what we're going to do is study hunger in our tradition and what our tradition says about that. We're going to study what's going on with hunger in Morgantown, West Virginia, and then we're going to go out and serve, and then we're going to start the conversation over. Because I do think that that would help, again, with that sense of helplessness and where to plug in. Because I did read the book about that increasingly people aren't engaged in civic activities, and I think some of it is just the overwhelming sense. And I would put an aside in that some of it is students these days are working 20 hours a week. We had someone show up for a pancake breakfast on Sunday morning who was going to work at Kroger right after that. And so how do we engage students who are increasingly having to pay for college in ways that many of us didn't have to, even in my generation? The other thing I would say is we have had success, if there was success, with things that happen on site, not having to go very far. So the Harless Center is a community center attached to a housing complex that is hoping to create a community of people who want to have interfaith conversations, who want to serve, who want to become better citizens in the world. And we have success with eating together. Food always works. And we had success with providing transportation directly to a Habitat event and then bringing something on site to do for service. And there are many opportunities for service on site. We were painting bowls for a feeding program, and that brought out the most people. I would then end and say that I do wonder, as a person of faith, working sort of not in academia and not in a congregation, if we aren't called to, what are the ways we're called to be civic-minded in congregations, in religious institutions in this pluriform world, as the people I'm ministering to don't look and share or talk in the same language that may be being talked in church. So one of the things we do, and do well, I think, is teach Sunday school. That seems small, but interact with congregations, lead worship in ways that are authentic to us, and we do art, and that's sort of an aside, with a congregation and not. But those are also other ways that your faith, I think some of the best teaching happens when you have to turn around and teach someone else, whether that's through preaching or teaching. So back to that first point, if what we're supposed to do is help people with that framework that they have, one of the ways to do that is also to engage in community of faith and to challenge how that community sees the world in their own framework. I would end with these cautions. The social media one about being absorbed with ourselves, the demands on college students' time today, the overwhelmed by options in a world where we can see everything that's going on. I keep thinking to myself, like, this is not the context of the Bible. They didn't know what was going on in another continent when they were writing that. So how does that even apply to today? That we can engage by clicking, and is that engagement? And then I do wonder about the works righteousness and community service and commodifying service on college campuses. Increasingly, you can get some sort of credit for participating in community service, and that isn't necessarily consistent with at least some theological traditions. And has that weakened the import of civic engagement when it's going towards a grade or graduation? So, thank you.